Okay. All right, everyone. So welcome to our session on opening up this question of do no significant harm. We're going to be hosting this as a somewhat interactive discussion. We'll be trying to weave in some of the research that we've been doing on this question as we go, and also just have a genuinely open discussion with all of you here participating today about what's coming up for you as you learn more about this topic. So in light of this sort of discussion format, we do invite you to turn on your video and participate in that way. And also we'll have the chat active as well. And as a way to just get familiar with the chat, you can see that Rob is starting to present you with some prompts that we have. So if you could start by renaming yourselves, just adding your name and organization. And you can do this by right-clicking on the three dots in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, just as a way for us to better get to know each other. My name is Michael Bernstein. I'm a researcher at the Center for Innovation Systems and Policy at the Austrian Institute of Technology, and co-presenters with me today are Rob Smith. Rob, I'll let you introduce yourself at Edinburgh.
I'm muted. Yeah, I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Edinburgh. I work in the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation Studies. And most of my work looks at the development of emerging biotechnologies like synthetic biology. I've worked very closely with research funding organizations on ideas cognate with transformative innovation policy, but that have mainly been around responsible innovation. We have a session tomorrow as a little plug talking about some of that work. So,
thank you, Rob. And Thomas.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Thomas Franse. I'm a senior researcher at the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University. And here I mainly study research governance, specifically evaluation and funding and its effects on the content of research and practices. And more also issues around sustainability in research. Yeah, looking forward.
Great, thanks, Thomas. And the fourth member of our quartet, Mandy de Wilde, is that right? I think that pronounced it right. At the University of Amsterdam, has an expertise in situated knowledge production, circularity, and human environment relations. She couldn't be here today, but has definitely been instrumental in our thinking together on this topic. So before we dive in, just one more sort of housekeeping arrangement. We would like to try to save the chat from this conversation. And so in order to do that, we want to make sure that that's okay with everyone who's here. So if you could respond either yes or no, if you're not okay with our saving the chat, and we'll just go through as we see the conversation and just filter out people's comments if they were not okay with saving the chat. So just please reply all with that, and then we'll just jump in. And Bertha, I think you just joined right after that went through. So I was just inviting people to say whether or not they're okay with us just saving the chat, because we'll be hosting this conversation as an interactive discussion. Great. All right. So as you can kind of guess, we're kind of going old school, new school with this presentation, where we're just going to keep everything in the conversation in the Zoom room. We'll use the chat a little bit, but we're not going to make anyone switch to other platforms or put in slides and all that stuff, because we are genuinely interested in your thoughts on this emerging topic. We sort of came into this. I came into this topic of do no significant harm back in July, attending a European Commission presentation on tips and tricks for Horizon Europe, and nestled within the presentation was this little bit of, and now we're also introducing this criteria of do no significant harm. For me, I thought, well, that's interesting. What's this about? Because I have a background in studying responsible research and innovation, which has been also a priority of the Commission and integrated in some of its calls. And at the same time as this was happening, Rob has been hosting a series of dialogues with participants of the European Research Area Network CoBiotech to start conversations about questions of responsibility and science and practice. And one of his invited speakers was Thomas, who gave a nice presentation on issues of framing in research and how that opens up or closes down what's possible in these kinds of in research and innovation activities. And the three of us and Mandy started speaking about this question of what might this idea of do no significant harm actually mean in practice, and how do we think about how that might be implemented at the commission level and affect potentially our research trajectories. So I'd like to start off by just asking people to step back and think, when you think about this idea of significant harm and research and innovation systems, what comes to mind? What comes to mind for you?
And just to say, so the way we'll do this is I'll post the question into the chat, and if you all just have a think and then respond, and then we'll invite people to elaborate on those responses as we move through. So, so there you go.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah. So take a minute and think about your response, and then we'll pop them in, and then we'll give everybody a chance to read what comes up and have a chat. Okay, Lakshya, great. Yeah, sounds like don't be evil, right? Diana, welcome. Thank you. Yeah, unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. Great. So yeah, so Diana and Rob, this question of how do we bound what is significant? Thinking of ethics, yeah, integrity. Karen, would you mind saying a little bit more about what you mean in terms of framing what stakeholders are doing or thinking without asking them?
Sure. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
I'm calling in from Boston.
Oh, thank you.
In the vicinity of the AIT of Boston, MIT, and Harvard affiliated with a program called Risk and Prevention, but I have my own mission-driven innovation and strategy consultancy, local to global. The thing that I was thinking of, even just the other day, someone was introducing me to someone, and they were framing what I was doing in a way that did not feel correct. And so I, in a kind way, reframed for them how I look at what I'm doing. So if you're thinking about a larger group of stakeholders, and other people are coming in and evaluating what they are doing or how they're doing it or they're thinking, and they're making assumptions without really understanding their framework or what they're doing or what their intentions are, I think that can do harm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Sort of the misrepresentation and what that does to
especially researchers, I would say. It can be a detached way of looking at things, I think, sometimes, or very rigid constructs of how particularly researchers are doing the research. And the importance of quantitative, of course, but the qualitative orientation, I think, is really important. And they talk about participant observers in anthropology. it's a tricky balance how to stay objective without losing humanity in the process. That's sort of what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, Thomas, you looked like you were going to unmute or.
No, sorry, I was thinking. I wanted to ask Katia Berada if you could elaborate a bit on examples of making the situation worse than before the start of the intervention from the research and innovation space, if you have any. So I would be really interested to hear a bit about that.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, I didn't have any specific examples in mind, but I was thinking in situations where, for instance, the intervention can provoke some type of misunderstanding or misconception of something. So creating more blurriness rather than at the start. So that's what I was thinking of.
And what would the blurriness be around? Sorry, you're going to have to respond then. So do you mean in terms of creating more ambiguity within the research process, or do you mean, yeah, where's the kind of blurriness there?
Yeah, I had that in mind, like creating more like blurriness. So making the situation more complicated for the stakeholders rather than clarifying things. So, but again, I didn't have a specific example, but I think that would be one situation where the do no harm would actually happen.
So complicating problems rather
than complicating problems,
or
basically,
addressing
yes.
them, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Yes.
So I'm sure there are other ways besides, for instance, randomized controlled trials or research that I don't know how many frameworks there are used for research. I'm a researcher, but I'm not a researcher of like RCT kind. And I'm wondering, when a group is being studied like that, and I guess this is also back to do no harm, how relevant is it, do you think, for the group that is being studied to understand what even RCT is, for instance, or the frameworks that research are using to research? Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah, that makes sense. And this kind of relates, I think, to how Diana was sharing what she thought about ethics and integrity. There is, coming from the US, there's this idea of, oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking on the name of the board process. Ethics, there's an ethics review process.
Institutional review boards.
Institutional review boards. Thank you, Rob. Oh my gosh. That's going to be on the internet forever.
You're the American, so.
Yeah, I know. Institutional review boards. So every organization, research organization, has these institutional review boards that are responsible for vetting human subjects research with human subjects, people, in a variety of circumstances, from medical to anthropological to sociological. And as part of, on the one hand, also reviewing the procedures being used by the research team, they also generally, a sort of cornerstone of that process is informed consent. So anyone being interviewed or surveyed or observed has prior informed consent that they are capable of giving. And that is a way to control or safeguard against, I think, what it is you're asking about, Karen, which is sort of actively taking advantage of people by researching them without their consent, for example, potentially.
Sorry, I don't know if I can intervene.
Yeah, please.
By giving an example. So, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Khadija, and I also work in evaluation, but my background is mostly in evaluating development programs. So, for instance, I worked in one RCT, and that was done in Morocco, and the aim is evaluating training programs for promoting entrepreneurship for women. So in this situation, to avoid any ethical issues, there was, of course, one group that received the intervention and one that did not receive it, but the intervention was going to be administered to all the women. So it was just sequential. So we had one, let's say, control group that will receive the intervention in 2 years, while the other one received it from the start. So it was a way to make everyone have access to the same intervention and have less ethical issues, because everyone will actually get the benefit of the intervention. So we're not withholding something from others. So that was one way to go around it.
Yeah, and so for sure, I think what's come up so far in the kind of things that people have said is that, I mean, obviously the idea of do no harm is very well established in the medical fields and health fields with, you know, things like the Hippocratic Oath. And in, I think, perhaps what Michael will talk about a little bit later, is that that kind of idea has been invoked by some politicians in Europe. And there are obviously lots of kind of examples of innovations or changes to research protocols that people have gone through to try and address that kind of that question of harm. So I think it's definitely a kind of a lesson, a message for us, is to make sure that we begin to engage with that as we kind of move forward with our thinking around this area.
Yeah, and it was interesting. What's interesting to me is that, or continuing on now, just to provide a little bit of additional background. When I originally was thinking about this question, I was thinking, oh, people are probably going to share maybe about the Manhattan Project or Chernobyl or AI activities, and it's interesting to me that we've been talking more in this context so far about some of the social harms that can happen, whether it's to reputation or to human subjects, because the way that this phrase "do no significant harm" is actually coming into the research field more broadly in Europe right now is associated with a regulation that was passed in 2020 as part of the larger Green Deal effort of what's happening in Europe right now to facilitate investments in sustainable activities. And this idea of a do no significant harm principle is referencing specifically 6 environmental objectives of the European Commission about relating to climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, the sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, the transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and the protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. So Rob just chatted a little bit of that background information in, and we can now see the 6 environmental objectives as bullet points in the chat. So this to me is interesting, that there's all these types of harm that are not really addressed by focusing on the environmental, but that research also relates to. And this is the formal way that the Commission is starting to think about this idea of do no significant harm. So in light of this, I'd be interested to hear basically how you're thinking of how you would react to seeing these principles as something that you have to think about in your own research as researchers, because the way that this idea of do no significant harm is starting to come up in European Commission funded research is to include in the methodology section of a research proposal and in the impact session of a research proposal some kind of reflection on whether or not the project that you're proposing is potentially going to do significant harm, and ways you could mitigate that. And so for those of you that are researchers, think about maybe you're investing in writing a new proposal. If you're from a funding organization or a nonprofit or support mission-oriented innovation in other capacities, think about the research that you focus on. And just share maybe one sentence in the chat about like, okay, this is sort of what I research, so we can get a sense of what people research, and then we'll go on to the next question. So Rob just shared 3 sort of generally similar questions. If you could share take a minute to think about it, type it in the chat, and respond to one of these prompts. And so if you have something typed in, you can press enter and we can start reading back through what people are sharing. Great. Great. Okay, so we have a mix of some social, some health, a lot of focusing on transitions, transdisciplinary work. So let's imagine that we're filling out proposals for the European Commission for a project coming up, and we come across this idea of do no significant harm. So take a few minutes now, and Rob is going to post another prompt in the chat, and you don't have to respond to this one because I don't want to make it so that you have to write something down about maybe harm in your research, but we'll talk about, you know, what you're thinking about and see, and then we'll have some follow-up questions after that. So think about the research that you do and your interests, and think about how maybe the research that you do comes into conflict with different environmental objectives. We'll just give you 2 minutes to think. You can take some notes maybe on some paper, and then we'll ask a follow-up question. And Carmen, welcome. We're hosting sort of a talk discussion session around the topic of do no significant harm in the European Commission research landscape. At the moment, we've just asked people to think about the research that they do, and think about how the research relates to different environmental objectives of the European Commission, which the European Commission has identified as important to safeguarding, to prevention. Oh, never mind. This is great. I could be trolled. I'm being trolled by participants.
Is it a name? It's a name, not a person.
Okay, so
shall I post a question?
Yeah, please. So now that you've had a chance to think about your research and this question of do no significant harm, I'm interested to hear how you feel when you think about the idea that, you know, research and innovation that you're doing could possibly cause harm. How manageable would it be to redesign your methods to avoid this kind of activity to the environment? And what would you need to be able to do no significant harm? Yeah, take a couple of minutes to think about that. And if you could put in a few words in the chat, that would be great. And then we can just open up to a larger conversation. So if you're able to put in some thoughts in the chat, that would be great, and we can take a few minutes to read. People are sharing, and then have a discussion. Yeah. So I'll let maybe Rob, if you wanna share a little bit about what you're thinking, and then we can go around to other folks.
Yeah, and it would be great to hear from Karen, because actually this relationships part is definitely what we've also part of what we've been thinking about with this concept as well. So, but I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because we're all like social and policy researchers in some way, rather than natural and social, natural material physical scientists. That most of these kind of concepts are, I think, are targeted at when people like the Commission start trying to develop these ideas. So it's quite a fun game to try and make us do this exercise. Yeah, I guess, I mean, like, obviously we're kind of like always conscious of the potential harm, kind of social harm, reputational harm associated with the work that we do, and I think we kind of try not to create any of that stuff. But the most obvious, like, environmental harm is, I mean, what is the carbon footprint of a paper, or the carbon footprint of going to conferences? And in some ways, it's a bit of a bind, isn't it? Because the need for our jobs depend on networks and relationships and informality, and so kind of I feel like in-person conferences and networks have to be maintained through travel, and travel is the kind of, I would say, the big thing for us, and that kind of is associated with the impact of that travel, you know, the intercontinental plane air travel, and the kind of amount of it that happens within academia. I think a big part of it is because of the kind of pace. And so the fact that like it isn't really possible for you to do kind of longer trips. Often people end up taking like intercontinental flights to Egypt or to sub-Saharan Africa or to the US from the UK for a couple of days, which is crazy. You would never do that if you were paying for it yourself. So I think there's a kind of relationship to evaluative cultures and the kind of norms of academia that have obviously accelerated recently. And then I suppose I was also thinking about, like, I don't think I do direct. Yeah, it's kind of related to what who was it? Someone said something about kind of doing direct harm. But I study people making genetic engineering, and a lot of the things they're making terrify me. So I suppose there's some kind of obligation there. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, Lakshya said that. It would be interesting to know what you kind of were thinking of with the indirect effects. But
yeah, I think I will. I share similar thoughts what you just said. As a researcher, it's very difficult for me to think of my work having a direct effect on the points that you listed earlier regarding climate and sustainable use and all of that. Yeah, but I also realize, when you say that even printing a paper might have effects on these, these kind of effects which you had listed down. But the indirect effects that I had in mind when I wrote that was, for example, I study forms and how can a developing country like India catch up or industrialize in sectors. So yeah, so I do see there an effect that let's say if my policy recommendations are accepted and then there is some action on them, and that leads to an industrialization process which is not sustainable, then that can definitely have some harm. So I was thinking it from that point of view.
I don't know if Michael wants to say anything in response to that. I have thoughts, but
No, please.
yeah, well, it's just interesting, isn't it, actually? Because part of the reason for flagging this is that Michael flagged that the European Commission, one of the ways that the European Commission is thinking about this concept is at the grant evaluation stage, so people have to write impact statements and things like that. But what you were mentioning is like, well, actually one of those harmful impacts could come from recommendations and things. And so we're thinking about where is the most, I think we agree that this kind of set of issues is important, but where in the innovation system is it most appropriate or useful to think about intervening within that? And I think we're unsure whether that is at the grant evaluation stage, but in terms of, policy impacts and recommendations, that clearly is one of those, a potentially really important point that we hadn't thought about. So thanks for raising it.
And
Can I bring up oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just,
Go ahead.
again, I'm being a little bit pre-associative in my thinking when I hear something. But when I think about those that are chosen, let's say in the European Commission, to be the evaluators, thinking about who and why they are choosing and what is the framework that they're using to make decisions about those that are going to be evaluating the grants, and the equity of that, of how many people are being reflected, I guess, on the evaluation team in the grantees, if that makes sense. What is the diversity of evaluators in their mindsets and experience?
Yeah. So certainly,
That makes sense.
Yes. No, it does. I was just reacting. I think certainly in a case where evaluators are being asked to determine whether harm is significant or not, and whether it's complying with this idea, it would absolutely make a difference. The composition of the review panel, their expertise, what they're resourced with to make these determinations, and of course their own life histories and experiences.
And biases.
Biases, yeah. No, that's a good point. And Thomas, you were gonna say something as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about what Tessa is working on and what Kadia and I also work on, which is sort of around evaluation frameworks. And I know that evaluation frameworks I work with don't really take environmental consequences of the first or the second order into account. And I was wondering whether Tessa works on the evaluation of experimental systems, no programs, I think. And Kadia works on evaluation of interventions that also involve local indigenous population impacted. And I was wondering whether environmental consequences are part of the evaluative frameworks that you both work with, or that you study or reflect upon.
Yes. Yeah, I think the evaluation frameworks that I mainly study are very much focused on looking at sustainability experiments. So the experiments are trying to create this socio-technical change, and so the main goal of the framework is to analyze how the experiments impact this change, so a sustainability change. So I do think they take it into account, but they cannot take everything into account. So that might be a challenge for this.
Hello. So in my case, I did work also on, for instance, a project on wood logging. in sub-Saharan Africa. In that case, the entire evaluation framework was focused on sustainability and also environmental impacts. But for instance, by implementing policies to prevent wood logging, let's say local and indigenous population have lost a source of income, because it was like a way of like actually a resource that a lot of families would live from. So that's maybe an intended impact that did happen. So like the forest was preserved, but for instance, there was this entire dynamic on how to find alternative solutions and prevent this source of income to be actually harming the population that didn't have any resources anymore.
Yeah, that's a great point about how, and this is something that I wish Mandy were here to talk about, but how if we don't adequately situate harm in the historical local context in which it might be being experienced or carried out or inadvertently affected, we just end up displacing it in other populations, right? So this idea of, okay, well, we safeguard the forest and now we've displaced the harm on people that might not have been involved in the process, right? And so it's an interesting question that comes in, I think, of this idea of how do we really pay attention to those kinds of contexts in which the research happens, to be very careful with that. Thomas.
Yeah. And there's also something in what Diana is saying, that she is very explicitly aware of the who wins and the who loses in the work that she is engaged in. And I was wondering if she could tell us a little bit more about this, because one of the things we are worried about is that this do no significant harm principle will be very much located or situated within Europe, that there should be no harm to the European project, but that harm is then relocated to India, to wherever, as long as it's not Europe, so that we're sort of externalizing our harm elsewhere. But I was wondering about Diana's experiences with thinking about this question.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, now that you were talking about evaluation, I think it's kind of this kind of a way that you know if you will do significant harm or no. And then I was thinking about the kind of different frameworks that Khadija and Cesar were mentioning, and also a little bit Karen. And I think that like with the approach of who wins and who loses, and when to think about that, not only thinking about technologies and mostly technologies that can be applied to solve different challenges. The approach that we take within the consortium, well, the experimental policy engagements that we are doing, is that we don't do a summative evaluation, like kind of you have some outputs within your project and your framework, and then you can kind of check if you achieve them or no, but you are not actually addressing the outcomes, the changes that you want to produce. And with within those changes, like those outcomes, who are defining those outcomes? It's only researchers, and what is the role of the different citizens and communities or people that will be involved somehow within the project? Is it enough to have a focus group and kind of a survey with some people and kind of extract the information and have the check in the output in the evaluation that you had participation? So that kind of questions are there. What we do is to build with the people, the core people that are designing the intervention, the project, the program, a theory of change, be very reflective on the process of what we want to do, what we want to achieve, what is that we want to transform, and always have present the what could be the unintended consequences. And for that, having direct people like in communities. I'm thinking of a project in South Africa related to water. So involving the leaders of the community, so like representative of the universities there, the engineers, it was related to like the ecological infrastructure as well as the hard infrastructure. But having those kind of even conflictive visions, putting them together, that requires obviously methodologies to deal with it, but kind of putting the different expectations and visions on the table, it is important. And I'm not saying that it's easy because it's super difficult. But I think that that is a good approach to, from the designing of the intervention, you have a monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan in place. That guides your designing, that guides your implementation. You go back, you don't wait until you have the outputs, and then you say, oh yes, this went wrong, but well, it's kind of a very kind of adaptive and in cycles. But also for doing that and giving the frameworks within the European Commission, we also need to push for kind of a different kind of evaluation, because it's not easy. If you say that you will do whatever you will do, then you will be evaluated against that. And you, even if in the middle you know that certain action or certain activity doesn't make any sense, if you said that you would do it, then you have to kind of explain or have mechanisms to provide flexibility. And that's another part that is related to the donors. So basically it's complex, but.
Yeah, but that, I mean, that's a great example, especially as you were talking in the end, sort of, it can't just end with this idea of, okay, we check the box, we've considered do no significant harm, and then have no flexibility built into evaluation periods within the project's life cycle and beyond it, right? It makes no sense to bind people and then not be able to be reflective about harm or activities that are happening in real time and new information that's coming to light about the activities and new actor groups being discovered as being implicated in these kinds of things. That's another place to bring in Karen. Yeah,
so
Karen,
what Kaja just brought up about the short-term versus medium-term, being that part of my multidisciplinary background includes film, I always thought it would be cool to pair up researchers and filmmakers. I don't know if anybody has seen 35 Up. It's a UK-based documentary. And this researcher, I think it was just very short-term inclined, where he was interviewing 7-year-olds and then proceeded every 7 years to interview these people. And I don't think it was meant to be a research project per se, but it's a very interesting exercise and the funding, where you got the funding is like a whole other ball game to do it for that long. But if you ever get a chance to watch it's like 7 Up and 14 Up and so on and so on. And I forgot the filmmaker's name, but it does come to bring to mind a different kind of evaluation in terms of this, how could you use film as a way to complement other evaluation strategies.
Yeah, or I'm thinking also, how do you use film as other media to bear witness to what's happening and to let people see if there's harm or something like that.
Yeah, also that. I think if I recall, IGL, Innovation Growth Lab, was looking into how to use some of that, but I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll take a note on that. And then Klaus, please, welcome.
Yes, I want to make one point. Actually, as a public administrator, I need clear impact measurement. I have to legitimize why taxpayers' money was spent for research and innovation projects. That's clear. And I can only do this with some indicators, with even measuring the macroeconomic effects, in a way, volkswirtschaftliche Leistungen, we call it in German. And I think this is still very important. What I experience in this transformative innovation policy sphere, there is something, a sort of a reluctancy to do that. We want to do now formative evaluations. We want to do it within the projects because we have all these interactive transdisciplinary project types. But these are two things. The one with a formative evaluation is good for and is a perspective of the researchers themselves. And they need this, and it's a sort of research where different stakeholders and including public administration is involved. So we have something like a learning, expecting learning effects, etc. And I think this is good. This is one side, but the other side is still remaining, which is really the public administrating building up programs, and they have to legitimize the financial budget. The public financial budget which goes into these programs. And I think we have always to make this clear and keep this in mind. And regarding the long-term aspects of policy actions, I did in 2019 an evaluation for the European Parliament of the white paper transport written in 2009 to 2011. And you would not expect how many things went in a total different direction, which could not be foreseen by any foresight project. There were a lot of foresight and forecasting to orient the white paper transport, which was quite a huge European policy initiative in the transport sector, a very prominent one. But the whole micro-mobility, the whole investment of the private sector in the mobility sector was not foreseeable in 2009 and 11. So with all these long-term effects, we have to be very careful because we live in such complex environments with not only social technical, but as well a lot of social cultural change, like these heavy investments or startup and venture funding in the mobility area in the last 5 years on autonomous vehicles, etc., which was not foreseeable 10 years before. And we have to keep this in mind. There are as well not for researchers, it could be a bit problematic because after to look at the impacts of a project after 10 years or could show that the project was nonsense, although it was very prominent and a good idea 10 years before, because the whole environment has changed. So yeah, keep this in mind.
Yeah. Well, to me, I don't know, Rob. I'll just say what I'm saying. And I was just curious about this question of then. Do no significant harm, which is coming up now in the research and innovation space. How does harm get measured or legitimized, or what happens if harm is measured in a public program as something that gets picked up in summative evaluations, and how does that affect, or how does that get measured in such settings? I don't know if that was clear. Maybe Rob is.
Yeah, I see a bit. I see it is maybe something like a sort of an overspending. I see a lot in some mission oriented areas at the moment. I see roadmaps for these missions along the innovation value chain, and then the project is finished, and then they have a small time of 2 or 3 years to deploy the project, so to fully enroll it in the market. And quite often, I think we know this from the past, when you do transformations research under historical near history perspective, you understand in the field a bit the innovation dynamics, and you know that a lot of these projects, a lot of money was spent for the researchers, and the researchers and innovators were happy, but there was no mission completed or no mission achieved at the end because the link to infrastructure funding or like private. That's not it.
Yeah, it's interesting. a harm done to taxpayers in some way by cutting projects short or not recognizing the full complexity of roadmaps or infrastructure pathways and things like that.
Yeah, I think that for me the task of an evaluator is that we are short in resources. We cannot spend money for everything. So a task of the evaluator is to look for good public money spending as well, and really control that and assess that, at least working in the public administration side.
Yeah. So I heard Karen was about to say something, and Khadija after.
Oh, just a question. And I was asking this over in general, and it comes to mind around technology and do no harm. And also, Klaus, if you ever work in evaluating AI projects. So when you talk about bias in AI, that seems to be a big one in terms of doing no harm, because that, that's loaded with potential bias, I think. And AI is such a buzzword and overarching mechanism that's being used now. So I'm wondering if people can speak to that particular issue.
I can make a point. Because you mentioned film, I'm a very great fan, meanwhile, of documentary films. There is this one film about predictive policing, which is nothing else than we do in research. There are interviews with experts. There are scenes where they show the problem, etc. And it's really fantastic. It's a sort of evaluation of ex ante evaluation, which is much more impressive sometimes if when I start to read a paper or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. Can you put that in the chat by chance? Can you put the documentary in the chat?
Yeah, it's called. I have to check it out. Predictive Policing or something like that. It is some time ago. Check it out.
And then Aja.
Sabrina came back. Sorry, yeah, I was just gonna say, like, when we're talking about doing no harm, and like what do we define as having done harm or not, I think it's very important to come back to when we're designing the intervention logic and reflecting about like the entire setting up of the evaluation itself, the different indicators, and also risks that are potentially coming from the intervention. This is the moment where it would be also important to maybe monitor and also put into account in the entire evaluation framework indicators that are linked to unintended effects and also potentially harmful things that are our hypothesis from the intervention. And since we're going to do a continuous monitoring, have this approach that would be adaptive, and every time, let's say, I collect my data every 6 months, paying attention to my risks that I have identified when I was designing my intervention logic, see to what extent this happened or not, and maybe also like pay attention to the fact of having new risks or new unintended effects, and including them in the next monitoring, let's say, session of data I collect. And then at the end of the phase of evaluation, kind of like reflecting to what extent the kind of like risks I identified potentially did happen or not, and how the entire like intervention evolved accordingly. But the intervention logic should be the kind of roadmap leading to that.
Yeah, so you can see how this kind of concept or this kind of set of issues fits quite neatly into maybe a project design or something, if you're kind of explicitly designing an intervention, in the abstract sense. But if it's intended to be an intervention, then it kind of fits very, very easily, and perhaps that's one of the places that it works. Klaus, I was interested in what you were saying, just I agree with you. I mean, the UK government is brilliant for this. All the UK funders, like the reason that impact became such an important thing 10 years ago in the UK is so that they needed ways. You have to have ways to perform the economic value to continue gaining money from the Treasury, and funders administrators in the funding organizations are remarkably candid about that, right? This is increasingly so. I think when this whole agenda emerged, they were a little bit tentative, but now they're very explicit about it. And again, with the ambiguity and the kind of uncertainty about where socio-technical journeys actually go, right, over time, I think is a really important point. I think, so for me, where that gets us is a kind of, you have to be in this kind of muddling through kind of way of doing things. You have to be kind of constantly kind of thinking and reevaluating rather than trying to make these big kind of projections of where things are going to go or where your harm is going to come in 30 years or even 5 years time. But what do you think, from a kind of administrator practitioner perspective, what do you think that means for the way that you would go about thinking about harm within a I don't know, say like a funding program or an initiative that you were involved in? I mean, does it? Yeah, that's the question.
I think there is quite a good sociological debate starting at the moment. If we have of horizontal governing. So we have a lot of actors interacting from a systems perspective, and with going into complexity research, for example, this work of Dave Snowden with this, I think you may know him from Wales. I think it's a lot about being adaptive to the situations, really to because with this evaluation of the white paper transport, it was interesting that in the interim assessment of the commissioner at this time, Mrs. Bulk at the time, that in 2015 it was still quite right with the prognosis and the prediction in the white paper. But then I think on a longer term, after 2015, all these huge investments and the venture capital in the Silicon Valley financing this micromobility, these scooters, with the whole system around with the precarious jobs to charge them in the night and all that. I think this all interacts, and this was not foreseeable. The 10 years before, and so we have to revise the plans, to revise the programs, to revise the projects. We have to be adaptive to them. For what this formative type of evaluation is, I think there is one in development programs. It's called narrative assessment, or so. It's a formative evaluation type. This is quite helpful and very useful, but we still need something like measuring. I sometimes say, a bit cynical, it may be not so harmful because it's only 3% of the overall budget which goes into R&I. But it's still the expectation that R&I and the missions in R&I will save the world. They are so high at the moment, although it's only 3%. And when it comes, for example, in the transport sector, in the infrastructure transformation, look, for example, the charging infrastructure. They tell us that we can only drive electric vehicles from 2030 onwards, but there is no charging infrastructure growing up at the moment. How will this work out? And then you go into the evaluation of in the infrastructure policy side, and it's a complete other community, which is not even in a way connected to the R&I community.
Yeah, it's less than 3% in the UK. We're aiming for 2.4 in like 5 years' time. So anyway. Michael, I guess.
I was just going to say, I see Laksha's hand is up too, and then I'll keep talking.
Yeah. So I think my question is regarding how do I think that's what maybe you are also trying to find out. But my question is really, so how do we even qualify what is a harm or not a harm? So I think the list that you shared earlier, according to that, EU is looking at harms for very, very particular things like climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, sustainable use of water and marine resources, and so on and so forth. So let me just pick up one example from what Klaus earlier mentioned about, these teams, these projects getting the money, but at the end of those 5 years, they get the money, but there is really no output. It's not really put into action. So yeah, that definitely is a harm. That's wastage of taxpayers' money. But what I would like to know, when EU is talking about harm, doing no significant harm, is it the kind of harm that EU is really pointing at, or is it very, very specific about these pointers about climate change, circular economy, pollution, biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera?
I have one idea. The harm could be implicit. So in the debates I'm involved in Germany about the automotive industry and the shift of automotive industry to electric mobility, this is in a way sometimes a bit strange, because when you look on a global scale on auto mobility, I think in Africa also we will still need 2030 onwards. We will have fossil fuel driven cars, and gasoline cars or so. And then the debate in my region, Baden-Württemberg, is something like, yeah, the whole car industry will shift to electromobility, and the companies they go this way because it's helpful from them, but they are global players, so they produce a gasoline car somewhere else in the way. Like Daimler-Benz is a very good, or Mercedes is a very good example for that. And then you lose, the harm is that you lose the jobs with all the second tier providers which are specialized on combustion engines in my region here, even in my small valley where I'm living, and you lose the jobs, but the cars are still produced for the global market, but then in another country or in another region of the world. And I think this is even I see it a bit as a strategy, because for the automotive company, for the OEM, it is maybe even beneficial, because the company can produce gasoline driven cars in other regions of the world cheaper, than in a high cost region like my region is. And this is a sort of an implicit harm which can happen.
In response to Laksha's question, it seems to be that they are now developing this very particularly to these 6 environmental goals set out in the Green Deal, and very specific to Europe. So do not harm the circular economy of Europe, and do not increase or harm climate mitigation and adaptation strategies in Europe. But it doesn't seem to be broader. So for instance, indeed, as the example Klaus mentioned, that we cannot probably produce cars in Europe, but then we can produce them somewhere else. So it is, and I think that's a question maybe that we can raise somewhere in the next 20 minutes. Listening to the conversation, I feel that we remain trapped within this very bureaucratic, conventional European governance system where we, even in a sort of a, if we want to make radical transformative change, we need indicators to show us that we're not harming economic growth, which makes me wonder whether this will in any way help to do anything radical, or whether it's just it will be a meaningless paper tiger. Because I don't feel a revolutionary sort of interpretation emerging in this European context. Because of course, yeah, we're also working with the money of taxpayers, so you want to spend it wisely. But if we keep sort of worrying about jobs, well, it's a very difficult question.
No, I think it's fully correct, but we have to be clear from a political science point of view. The EU, the European Union, is an economic integration union, and it's not a social union. And then we have this and on the national level, and then I think we debate it as well on the national level. Hopefully, not only having a mission. What we have now is a mission-oriented economy, to come to a mission-oriented economy. But it's still not the social side. There is quite a nice book. It's called The Great Recoil, to instead of Great Transformation, and it's from a Latin American author, and it is about the social emancipatory Hegelian idea of having really a just transition, and letting everyone economically participate. However, whatever jobs we give them, we have enough work. And even macroeconomic modeling in new monetary theory shows us that this would be easily possible, because the state has the sovereignty over the money and not the private sector. But then this is a debate. You cannot start this debate, unfortunately, at the European policy level. So we have to we can keep it European, but at another platform than the economic integration union.
Yeah, and I think this raises to me the question. One of the questions that I'm interested to discuss with people here is, so thinking about this, where are places, and what are reasonable expectations for where to locate these questions of harm, and in terms of who's responsible for reflecting on them, but also how they're defined, and also how we escape the sort of the trap of our own provinciality in some ways. Also, okay.
Someone else. I think
it's Diana. I just see you're on camera again. Would you like to share? Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, also reacting a bit of what Klaus was saying and your question, Michael. Like in these frames of and I'm talking now about policy of science and technology and innovation policy from more like a state vision, and it's the framework, the transformative innovation policy framework, that it's still emerging. And it's still like under construction. The kind of relationship between, like, or the answer to the question, innovation for what, science, technology for what, and for whom, and with whom, and like bringing on the European Commission framework, goes beyond the economic frameworks or economic models. And I know that, like working with different policymakers, like in one that I worked recently in Medellin in Colombia, it was like, yeah, when you say that you want innovation to solve societal problems, and then that is the focus, and then anyway, it's kind of good because now all of the countries have to align with the SDGs, you know, so it goes well. But then we cannot like leave aside the private sector, the economic models, competitiveness, you know, economic growth. So what you're saying that the focus are on, or the focus is on the societal problems, the environmental problems, and then the economic models can be impacted positively after it. Like that is not the focus. The focus are the challenges. It's kind of naive and romantic, but and that was like an ongoing conversation with policymakers in this city in Colombia. They were designing mission-oriented policies. It's very trendy. But then the first thought that came to my mind is like, okay, so what is the alternative? Because if we keep focusing on economic growth, and that is like the main reason, and then like the second framework more in the systems of innovation. So you go and put incentives to get people connected, different actors, you have intermediaries, your focus is on competitiveness, and you have economic growth, and well, innovation is always good, and then you'll have positive effects around. You don't really think about the possible effects of what you're doing. Right. Well, that hasn't worked so far. I know it's much more complex. Obviously, we need to make sure that there's a economic viability, and that's why now we're thinking also with the deep transitions, bringing on private investors, not only the state. You need to make it viable, but the focus is different. And when you have a different focus, then you have different indicators. Even if are the traditional indicators, if you have all your traditional indicators about the investment and returns of investment, you put them within a logic that is different in the transitions that you want to steer with your intervention. Being humble that you cannot affect the whole system, that you cannot kind of trigger a deep transition just with one policy. But if you have into account what are the changes that you want to create in people, in organizations, at the institutional level, and you are consistent with your activities and what you want to do, and you monitor that, and when you see, because it's complex, you don't have the answers beforehand. You know, that's another thing. Missions are very neat, and you are dealing with complicated problems. Complicated problems, you can anyway define them, and you have a set of solutions for them. But reality goes beyond that. We are dealing with complexity, and we don't know what will happen. We're just swimming there. We need to keep looking at what is going on. We need to bring on different stakeholders. That is complicated, that is painful, that will have many shortcomings. But what is the alternative? Keep using the same things? Hasn't worked. So what will we do?
Yeah, I really like that, and that point about both modest expectations, but also changing the goal was coming up to me as Klaus was sharing about the complexity theory and adaptive approaches. Then it seems that the reference point for adaptation becomes especially important. Otherwise, you're just always reactive to a situation, and there's no necessarily pull out of the current state, which is seemingly unsustainable. Laksha, you have your hand up, and then I see Klaus.
Yeah, so one thing that comes to my mind, and I'm really echoing some of the points which earlier speakers have said, is to go about it this way. So if you want to evaluate any project or anything, I think it is difficult for anyone to figure out what the harm is now, unless you first figure out who are the actors that are going to be affected by this particular project. So if you can figure out who the stakeholders are, then you can always go back to them and ask them what are the potential harms that this particular project may have on you. Because, I may think of XYZ as a harm, but the actors or the group of the actors who are really affected by that particular project, only they know what is a harm for them or what is not a harm for them, which as a researcher or as an evaluator, I may not be able to do it a priori. So I think the way to one way to go about then evaluating the project is to ask in the evaluation in the project proposal is to who are the relevant stakeholders which might be affected by this project, rather than asking directly whether it is going to have any harm or what harm, and then reach out to those stakeholders and ask them how could it potentially affect you. I do see it could be practically not very possible to do for each and every project, but I do think if we have bigger topics, let's say for example if you have AI, you can you can group together many projects which fit in that AI topic and then reach out to the stakeholders and ask them what are the potential harms that you expect from this technology. So yeah, I'm not sure if I was able to make my point, but I can always do it again later.
No, I appreciate that. I think that idea of sort of going about this question of harm a little bit, not sideways, but from a very realistic perspective of say, okay, we can't reasonably expect to understand the harm of other people that are going to be impacted without asking them. And we can't assume that researchers will have done it. So if we at least let them do the work of asking who they think will be affected, whether or not they've engaged them, then going to those people and sort of having a external, I'm thinking of Funtowitz and Ravit's ideas of extended peer review, having that kind of post-normal take on specifying the harm. I think that's a really nice idea. I see Klaus and then Thomas, and just calling out that Diana has shared a nice blog in the chat, as well as a book, a recommendation to something from Karen on gross national happiness.
Yes. Let me make a point. I'm sometimes a bit impatient, and the reason may be that I'm a bit an older semester. I'm 56, and so I made in sustainability research. I was as well already in another wave where we discussed circular economy, where we discussed the limits of growth, of economic growth daily in the 90s. Actually, one of my teachers was Donatella Meadows, and so on, and all these people, and then you have the same coming up again, and the same debates. And we know from system science even mechanisms and patterns, what happens when we stay somehow in this research and technology and innovation discourse. We tend sometimes to stay a bit in an elite discourse, and we take the social not sufficiently into account. And for example, in Latin America, we have in Peru now a left populist government, which is blocking a lot. Or we have fear that in my neighbor country, I'm living on border to France, that the presidency election, the next ones, there could be a right populist president in France. So actually these are the movements, and then we have a bit more problems with our social ecological transition when we forget about the social. And I think this is the reason why we have to be very balanced. And I think we had the notion in one other session about the social ecological or the mission-oriented welfare state for Sweden, which I love very much. So they try to better integrate the both. And when we have structural changes, with social ecological transition. I think we cannot afford to have the losers, the winners and the losers debate. I think this is not really possible. We have really to think how we manage as well the structural change from a labor type. For example, I had a peer, do not know if you know the concept of new work, Fridtjof Bergmann, who was doing in Detroit when the first structural change in automotive industry in Detroit occurred. There was a lot of debate how to organize work for these people. And I think these are the issues we have to address with social ecological.
Yeah, exactly. What does this mean actually on the ground in practice, in reality? Like when people talk about whatever, like globalization, what does that actually mean? Like in terms of housing in a city, or when you talk about automation, what does that actually mean in terms of jobs in a factory somewhere, or like the same kind of these? Yeah, I agree fully with that kind of that approach. Yeah, it's great.
And Thomas?
Yeah, I wanted to say in response to Diana, so she made me realize that what has been slightly annoying to me about this principle of do no significant harm is that it's not modest. And I think her take on, I would rather have that we would have systems change tomorrow, but I like her take, which is much more nuanced and realistic. But this principle doesn't reflect the uncertainty and the caution and the modesty that we really need to have when we try to do something, because it just says do no harm, which implies that we can notice, that it's easy to notice, that it's easy to not do harm. It also implies that the EU has not been doing harm, and that's clearly not the case. So I don't know. It's not a very original thought, but it's so Diana's comment really helped me to get behind why I was a bit annoyed with this principle. So thank you for that.
Can I mention something? Just briefly, nothing profound. But
yes, please.
When I started, so part of my background was building social impact programs for nonprofits, very much a practitioner innovator, not so focused on the evaluation piece. But in any case, when I came to Boston and post-Harvard, I realized through some of my mission-driven global projects, I realized that it was going to be important for me to enter into science, technology, innovation, and private sector to do broader good, I guess. And then I started thinking about and my first project was within a cybersecurity firm, hacking. And in any case, as a reflective person, I just started thinking about, the implications of these innovations, and discovered through the Harvard Kennedy School this whole big group of people that are involved with science, technology, and society. And it just, it really helped me to begin to have a community of people that cared about implications of all these innovations. So it just brought to mind that.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I would say that we're definitely among that group of people that care about those implications, and this is another form of trying to support, I think, system perspective taking, if you will, in that context. We are officially at time, so I would like to just thank you all for going with us on this experimental journey of a Zoom conversation without any presentations or any mural boards, and for really bringing up some really great points and taking this conversation in some great directions. Do connect with us on the Socio Events platform. We'll stay in touch that way. And yeah, thank you all.